Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Tuesday evening, January 7th. Recording this episode a little bit later than I had originally hoped, but we're here nonetheless with Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall. Before we get to Ryan, wanted to take a moment and remind you that this episode of Podcast on the Brink, as always, brought to you by our friends at Visit Bloomington. Visit Bloomington is also a proud partner of Indiana University Athletics. Right now, Visit Bloomington is giving you and one friend the chance to score free Hoosier basketball tickets. Go to visitbloomington.com/contest. That's contest with an S on the end. Enter the IU men's basketball giveaway. The winners will also receive a free gift card to Buccetto's Pizza and Pasta. That website, once again, is visitbloomington.com/contest. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. As I've mentioned recently, the game that they're going to be giving away tickets to UCLA coming up next month. I believe it's on Valentine's Day, February 14th. So as Indiana continues to win more games here, could be a really important matchup as the Hoosiers look to build a case for returning to the NCAA tournament. Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall is back on the show, and Ryan was at the Palestra on Sunday afternoon for Indiana's 77-71 victory over Penn State. Ryan, I understand it was your first chance to check out the Palestra. What were your thoughts on the building, the atmosphere, everything that one of the more storied venues in college basketball has to offer?
Yeah, so I guess for those that don't know, I do live just outside Philly now with my wife and daughter. My wife is originally from this area, so certainly had heard about the Palestra from in-laws and such. But the great thing for me was door to door, it was 25 minutes, and to be that close to Big Ten basketball, I can't say even in my Chicago days, having to get up to Evanston definitely took me a little bit longer than that for sure. And not since a student in Bloomington was I that close to a Big Ten arena. So that was really nice. And but yeah, in terms of the arena, kind of crazy that they're calling it like the longest running or like the oldest major place going that actually has college hoops games going. I think it's 1927, so it's almost 100 years old. They really do a fun job of playing it up. Out in the concourse, kind of the hallways areas, they have a bunch of faces of famous coaches and famous players that have played there, and it's the list is very long. So yeah, I've never actually been to Hinkle, but it definitely has some of those vibes. I think Hinkle was the year after, I think it was 28 it was built, but definitely have kind of that field house, sort of that arched construction to it at the top. So really cool. And I think we were kind of estimating there on Meter Row, I think probably 80-20, maybe somewhere between 80-20, 75-25 in terms of Penn State in Indiana fans. Obviously, Indiana being that 25 to 20% maybe. And I do think, they certainly made their voices heard, but that was definitely a pro Penn State crowd. The loudest I think it got all game was on a 10-second violation that Miles Rice had when they really got it close there. It was loud, and it was definitely pretty impactful crowd.
Yeah, so from what you're describing, having been to the Bryce Jordan Center one time in State College, that's probably the only time I'll make it to that venue. I remember I was actually there. It was the 2013-14 season, which was the year after Indiana was, the number one seed. It was the Noah Vonleh season. They went up to Penn State and drove up for that game on a Friday. They played at noon on a Saturday. Jordan Littman was with me. We drove back the same day on Saturday after the game was over. And that, in terms of, I've not been to all of the Big Ten venues. I've been to quite a few. By far, it's been described by some as a morgue, and definitely that day. There was maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people there. And so I bring that up because when Indiana got this draw of going to the Palestra, to me, it was, obviously on paper, it's a neutral site game in some aspects, but having to go play at the Palestra as opposed to the Bryce Jordan Center, not necessarily the most favorable draw. So even more impressive that Indiana was able to go there and get a win. In terms of just the feel, in terms of the arena inside there, I'm curious, like the sight lines and everything. How was that in terms of watching the game? Because on TV, when they showed it, it was kind of hard to tell how high up the seats were. But I know from a media perspective, you were up top, but it seemed like you had a pretty good view up there.
To me, there's not a bad seat in there. I think it's small enough that, I mean, yeah, the media row I was in was all the way at the top on the side that the benches were on, and it was a great sight line, and it was good up there in that last row. I mean, maybe if I'm in the corner, it might be a little bit different, but to me, I think it's small enough in there that there are gyms. I'm sure there are as you know, there are a number of high school gyms in Indiana that seat more than the Palestra. I think could be wrong. It was maybe 9,000. Is that way off? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I should Google that as we're talking here. But
I read that that the capacity was like 8,700 or something.
Yeah.
But then when I actually looked on Stat Broadcast the other day for the actual attendance, and it had it under 7,000. So unless there's some discrepancy there in terms of the seating, but it was relatively full, right? I mean, there weren't empty seats.
Yeah, it was probably 95% full. I mean, yeah, there were some seats that weren't occupied, but it was close to a sellout. And yeah, I'm seeing here it says it has a capacity of 8,700. And but every one of those seats feels like it's right on top of the court, which, again, being in the last row, I agree, you're definitely in it there for sure.
So in terms of the actual game, a bit of a surprising result, because when the line came out, I think Indiana was a 6.5-point underdog, and then Penn State kind of ballooned up to, I think, to 8.5 by tip-off after news kind of broke that Malik Renew was going to be out, which kind of, as we now watched almost 2 full games without Malik Renew, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but Indiana, there's an argument obviously that they're a better team just going with the one big lineup. Not saying specifically Malik Renew has anything to do with it, but it's, Indiana going with the one big has been more favorable in terms of the results the last 2 games. But just Indiana's ability to go in there and withstand the pressure that Penn State had on the ball, I thought that was impressive. And then that run really to begin the second half where Mackenzie Mbako scores 8 points. But not only that, but Indiana was able to stretch that lead out to 16 points. And had they not been able to do that, that I think there's a strong argument that Penn State comes all the way back and wins that game. They actually had a chance later in the half to take the lead. But I thought really an impressive game, maybe the best game wire to wire that Indiana's played all season. Just, do you agree with that? And what maybe stood out in terms of the game and how it played out from your perspective?
I do, just because, yeah, as I wrote after the game, this is the type of win they've been searching for all season, where they actually get this. It does count as a quad one win for them. And, they had some opportunities in the Bahamas that they did not capitalize on, and haven't had really any other team so far. I mean, playing Minnesota and playing Rutgers, right? These are teams that are below them in terms of metrics and such in the Big Ten. So this was kind of their first test. And again, it being in a semi-road or road environment, to me, I think a couple things stand out. Certainly their energy and their effort, and like they brought the fight, right? They didn't really shy away from anything. And I think that's something that at times this season they've kind of come into games and kind of loafed around a little bit, especially in some of these guarantee games. And maybe they've had, too long of a stretches in some of the bigger games where you can say, okay, well, they're just a little bit out of it here, or there's some poor defense for minutes on end, or they're not really getting after it on some of those little details. But I think in this game, for the most part, they did do all that. And then, a couple other things, I think, in both the Rutgers and Penn State game that things that are starting to do a better job of, and I'm not necessarily saying that they've turned a corner or this is a trend. I mean, things can kind of go up and down, and, this is just a small 2-game sample size, but offensive rebounding, and that's that effort thing that I think earlier in the season, people were tearing their hair out watching these games, the fan base of, you have all this size and all of these, you're not capitalizing at any offensive rebounds at all, and having really issues on both sides of the the court rebounding. And I think these last two games, against Rutgers, they grabbed 38.3% of their misses. Against Penn State, they grabbed 37.1. And if you look at their, profile on Ken Palm now, they are rebounding 34% of their misses, which is 65th best in the country. So they're actually starting to become a pretty decent offensive rebounding team, and that's getting them extra chances, right? And I think off of that too, a lot of the issues sometimes with their opponent shooting a lot of threes or more threes than them, these long rebounds that were kind of flowing over their heads, and then the opponent was getting the rebound. Well, in these games, they've also shot more three-pointers, which has kind of allowed them to play that game a little bit more that was getting played against them, right? So against Rutgers, their three-point rate, which is the amount of threes that they're taking over their total field goals, 37.5%. Against Penn State, it was 39.6. As we know, for the season, they're super low there. They're at 33.1, right, which is 315th in the country. And just for context, again, Rutgers 37.5% of their shots, Penn State 39.6. If you go average that to about 38.5 between both games, that gets you about into the low 200s nationally. So you're almost in that range of, okay, you're shooting about excuse me, or what an average team is in the college basketball in D1, right? So I think those are just some interesting numbers to point out. I mean, I think defensively too, 0.99 against Rutgers, 1.01 against Penn State. If they can kind of keep these teams around 1 point per possession and then also get extra chances with offensive rebounds, shoot more threes and make them. They've shot 44% against Rutgers, 44.4 and 39.1 against Penn State. So I think some of those trends in these games, this is what has helped them, is they've gotten a little bit more attention to detail with the rebounding. They've increased their 3-point volume and they've made them. And they've D'd up a little bit more, and that's just going to win you more games, especially against teams that are good like Penn State is.
So how much of the increased, 3-point volume and the offensive rebounding, obviously there's a connection between those two, because as you mentioned, the more threes you take, obviously the longer rebounds are really an important thing, because those a lot of times are easier to get than just crashing the glass and trying to go in the paint, especially when guys have blockouts and things like that. It's kind of hard to go in there and get, but with the longer rebounds, they've been able to get some of those and actually get probably some threes off of those opportunities as well. But I'm curious how much the increased 3-point volume in your mind is the result of the one big lineup being more of a thing the last two games. But obviously we saw the Winthrop game. They took, I think, 23s and went 1 for 20. And there was a lot of people on Twitter who were like, well, you wanted Indiana to take more threes and it just happened. And this is kind of what happened. They need to keep getting the ball inside. But that was kind of a ridiculous proclamation by those who kind of wanted to say that, from the standpoint of it's also a lot about how you move the ball and whether you're getting your shots in rhythm. And that, to me, these last two games we've seen with this different lineup, just more opportunities for guys to reverse the ball, and all of a sudden there's been cases in the earlier games where they move the ball around the perimeter and it's Malik Renew maybe getting that 3-pointer, and now it's Luke Goody or Mackenzie Mbako, and those guys are better than 35-36% 3-point shooters now in the season. In the case of Goody, I know Mbako is higher than that, but Goody's started to find his role. So I'm just kind of curious, like from your standpoint, how you think the smaller lineup correlates to the increased 3-point attempts and the overall success of the offense the last couple of games.
It certainly doesn't hurt, right? I mean, clearly, if you're going to have Luke Goody come in and start and play more minutes, he's on the court to shoot threes, right? When he's coming off the bench, he's still getting up a pretty good amount. So I think him just playing more certainly has helped. I mean, it's tough to, because I've looked back at enough film of this team, and I think in some sense they're definitely not just throwing Renew and Ballo down on the block and when they're in the game. Renew, they're still trying 4 out 1 in. There's 5 out sometimes. So I think there still is better spacing than sometimes people might give Indiana credit for. But that said, when you have Malik Renew at your 4, who I think he's 2 of 16 or something this year. He is not, his shot looks good to me, and I feel like he can hit that shot, but he just has not connected so far this year. And so again, swapping in the starting lineup, having Goody, and to your point too, some of the right guys taking the threes, and that's something that Mike Rhodes said after the game in his press conference. Somebody asked him, these guys don't really shoot a lot of threes, and they haven't made them at a great clip this year either. And his point was, well, they saw some go down last game, and that can carry over. But then secondarily, we let the guys that can make them shoot them tonight, this afternoon rather. And so with Goody and Mbako, and I know Rice is kind of down in the lower 30s, but that's still better than a Carlisle or a Tucker or a Renew taking those right at this point in the season. So yeah, I think the right guys, and with this lineup being really forced to go, they're kind of forced to play small now. You're going to see more threes as a result. And I think also having Miles Rice be able to have some more space to operate and to be more of kind of that pure point guard, both from having more gaps to drive. But I feel like these last couple of games too, he's been a stronger distributor and can be more himself. And I think that has also led to him finding 3-point shooters as well.
Yeah, Rice, I mean, you can see it. He's picking his spots better in terms of when he's trying to go to the rim, and he noticed he is definitely mindful that there's extra space now a little bit more in the paint than there was in those earlier games, and he does maybe at times get a little bit out of control. And I think there was one turnover he had against Penn State where it just like dropped the ball off his knee, and it was like he was sped up a little bit. But if you remember back to the early game against the exhibition game against Tennessee and some of the earlier games in the season where he's been really good, he was kind of getting to the rim and going to the basket. And he's actually a really good finisher at the rim. When you look at his percentages, it doesn't always look great, but when he does get in there and get kind of ahead of steam going to the rim, his 2-point field goal percentage overall and his field goal percentage at the rim, that was really one of the things I wrote about in the offseason when we looked at his profile at Washington State. He was a great finisher at the rim, and I think a lot of it is just his quickness and his speed in terms of being able to get by people with that first step and that explosion. He's not obviously a guy that finishes above the rim, but he's pretty crafty at actually getting into the paint and finishing plays.
He's also shooting 92.5% from the line. He's their best free throw shooter. So I think the more that he can get to the cup, and he's the one shooting the free throws, and that's kind of the flip side with Ballo, although obviously he's been great. And he was, that was the one thing I think, being there live versus watching on TV, you can really see how much bigger Oumar Ballo is than pretty much everyone else on the court. And you get the reason why they were feeding him, and it was working. But to that end, though, they also were shooting more threes, right? And I think that's a nice, if they can kind of get this combo of getting their bigs involved, getting those easy points in the nice matchups down low, getting these 3-point shooters, the right guys shooting and shooting more of them, and then Miles Rice finding his way amongst all that, getting those opportunities to drive the lane when there's more spacing, but also finding some of these guys, getting some shots of his own, is kind of like this right now, the emerging sweet spot of this team. But then there's the question of Malik Renew, who is their leading scorer. When he comes back, how does it work? Are they going to then kind of revert back to less threes and more trying to get both him and Ballo involved? And that becomes sort of I know last time I came on the pod, we talked about how they worked in Ballo, because he's very important for their rim defense. I mean, there's no question about that he's really their only one rim defender, and he's needed on there. But when he's in with Renew and with the spacing right, and kind of how to use him on offense while also needing him on defense. Because the one thing I can say beyond how they're going to rework Renew back in is it was also very clear to tell. I know Hatton has had some really good games for Indiana, but I think as the competition certainly is going to continue to stiffen, he can just tell he's I'm not going to compare him to Banks, like a completely different player, but not Caleb Banks. I'm thinking of guy that went to Ball State and then went back to Ball State.
Peyton Sparks.
Peyton Sparks. Thank you. I was going to say Sparks. I was like, is that right? Okay. Thank you. It's too late at night, people. Anyways, but as again, just them coming from a little bit less of a competition level, I think Hatton in this game, you could kind of tell that they could go to the rim against him. He didn't offer any rim protection at all. So I think as much as he's moved on offense and has rebounded well, I think his defense down low is going to be tough. It's a big drop off from him, from Ballo to him right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because you kind of led me into the topic I was going to bring up. It's like, so Indiana's now won 4 in a row. They've got USC on Wednesday. They go to Iowa this weekend. It sounds to me like Malik Renew's probably going to be out for at least a couple more weeks. Obviously there's no time frame has been put on it, but from the way Mike Woodson talked about it post game, it doesn't sound like his return is imminent. So we kind of have this little runway here for the foreseeable future where it's going to be the one big setup. And I've started to look a little bit into some lineup data for Indiana, and you mentioned kind of what they need Ballo for the the rim protection, all that. But and I hesitate to even throw numbers out there, but I know for a fact that Indiana with Ballo on the floor as opposed to Renew, the defensive numbers are much stronger. So there's a strong argument that Ballo, maybe isn't the back to the basket post score that Indiana has when they have Malik Renew out there, but there is a steep drop off defensively when you're looking at how opponents can get to the rim and score at the rim on Renew as opposed to Ballo. So you kind of tiptoed around this earlier, but what does happen when Renew comes back? Is it just going to be run it back to the same thing that we saw to start the season? Is there going to have to be a readjustment of roles? I know that Mike Woodson in the past hasn't necessarily, when a guy's been injured, just automatically thrown them back in the starting lineup, easing them back in. But is there a world where these guys are maybe playing together for 4 or 5 minutes a game and the rest of the minutes are split? I mean, is that the best case scenario, or how does Mike Woodson tackle this? Because I don't necessarily think he's just going to say, we'll split their minutes 20-20 a game and go from there. I don't necessarily think that makes the most sense, but I also don't know that going back to the same starting lineup when you're having more success. Now, this assumes this continues, right? They've got some games coming up here, but I don't know that you can just go away from this and say we're going to go back to what we were doing earlier in the season.
Yeah, it's an interesting lingering question for the rest of the season here. I mean, they have certainly staggered them at times. Clearly, they've started together, but there has been, as games have gone along, some staggering. So maybe you continue to see that, even if maybe they don't start. And and maybe it's kind of one of those classic. It's not who you start, who you finish with, but also knowing Malik Renew's kind of entire career here so far, maybe save for his freshman year, he's a guy they go to a lot, and he's a really talented scorer in the post, and that's been important. He scored a point for Indiana in games to really help them. So I think some staggering. I wonder if this group also gets some time and experience together, and they can kind of coalesce around him coming back and them having some more familiarity with each other. Maybe things kind of work themselves out a bit, and he can kind of be part of what they're doing now. Maybe he comes back and can hit a couple threes and keeps the defense honest, and that can kind of work itself out potentially. But yeah, it certainly will be interesting to see for however long he's out, what they do and if they can continue along on this route. I mean, it's hard for me to see him becoming like a 6 man and Goody starting. But I don't know. Stranger.
I guess my question is, if you know that your best chance to win games and give yourself success out of the gate is to play this one big lineup, why? And you mentioned kind of the saying, well, it's not who starts, it's who finishes. But wouldn't you want to put your best foot forward when the game starts, like in terms of giving yourself a chance to get out to a good start? To me, it's like just starting those two guys together because it's something you did early in the season or because that's kind of the role they expect isn't necessarily like you have to weigh that against we're trying to win games here, right? You don't want to start a game for 4 or 5 minutes with the two big lineup and all of a sudden, all right, well, it's not working. We're off to a good start. So now we're gonna go to what we know has worked these past couple of games. To me, it's tough because obviously there's egos involved and with the
Mm-hmm.
players and guys are have a role that they've come to expect, but at the same time you got to put the team first. And I'm not saying Malik Renew has to be 6 man. I'm not saying Umar Balo has to be 6 man. It's just we'll see what happens over these next couple of games. But if the evidence continues to grow that this team is playing better with this lineup, I don't see why you just start guys because they're the most talented for the sake of it. If
Yeah,
that makes
but
sense.
I get it. This is the roster construction though, right? And I think this has been sort of the root of, in some sense, the Woodson era of it looks better this way, or there's more space, or there's more freedom, or it's more modern, or they're shooting more threes this other way. Why is the roster constructed like this, or why is he playing these guys? Look, I can, again, there are other teams that play two bigs and they make it work. Now those, and as I've done film sessions on so far this season, I think the issue with Balo is he can't shoot and he can't really play in the perimeter. I mean, he can pick and roll a little bit, but he's no threat to really shoot on the perimeter. So you have a 5. I mean, you have a 4 in Renew, and if you put Goodyear and Baco there, okay, like you can get away with them playing on the perimeter and potentially being a threat to shoot, etc. But with Balo, you don't have that at all. But you need him defensively, and in some matchups down low, I mean, he's just absolutely dominant. So it's a weird. It's the puzzle pieces. In some ways, this is what everyone has been sort of wanting to see from Indiana this year, and the thing with this team is they have so much talent that when they have their leading scorer go down, there's enough other guys that can kind of score and that can come in and play and that can fill roles and they can play a different way where they can still be competitive. Where if this was another year, that wouldn't be the case, right? And who knows? There might be somebody else in the season that has to go out of the lineup for injuries and they might have to play a different way, right? So things can kind of take their own shape as this goes along. But yeah, I think this is the one of those tensions of the Woodson era of people wanting them to play and fans wanting him to play kind of a more modern style. And if it keeps going along where they are successful this way, I can certainly hear the chorus being even louder for them to continue in such a fashion.
Yeah, you also just mentioned like the talent of this team being able to kind of overcome this injury, but one thing that has become more apparent over the last couple of games is when Indiana has to go into its bench at certain positions, there's been a pretty significant drop off. And obviously, I'm talking about Kanan Carlisle, who started the season in the starting lineup. He has, to me, looks like his confidence offensively is broken at this point. I mean, he makes a 3-pointer occasionally, makes a good play occasionally. Still, I think plays relatively good defense. But this is a guy that some people were talking about on mock draft boards in the preseason. He's nowhere close to that right now. Bryson Tucker, a talented scorer, still a freshman, but his shot selection in certain instances has left a lot to be desired. The Penn State game, he took a 3, I think, early in that game, right when he came in, early in the shot clock. I tweeted something about it. Not necessarily the greatest decision, but he did play better. I thought as the game went along. But they've played Anthony Leal more lately, and I think we talked about this before we hit record. I think that's just a result of you got a guy that what you're going to get from on a game to game basis, in terms of his production. He may not be as a willing shooter. He may not maybe have the upside to make some of the plays that Carlisle and Tucker can make, but you know what you're getting on a game to game basis with Anthony Leal. And I do think moving forward that Indiana is going to have to find a little bit more from those guys that I mentioned on a consistent basis. It can't just be 1 out of every 5 games Kanan Carlisle shows up and plays well, or 1 out of every 5 games Bryson Tucker plays well, because the competition level is getting ready to pick up. I looked at where Indiana's strength of schedule right now is in the Big Ten. They've played the 18th toughest schedule. They're 3-1 in the league, but things are about to get much more difficult. So, what are your thoughts just in terms of what they're getting from the bench right now? Is what I'm saying even realistic to expect those guys to be more consistent, or is there enough body of work now that it just is what it is with those guys, and Indiana's going to have to ride the starters as much as possible?
Well, to your point on Leal, it reminds me of what happened last season when they went on that run at the end of the regular season, and Leal played more, and he had big plays against, Ohio State. He hit that corner three to win the game in Columbus. I think it was in the Big Ten tournament when they beat Penn State, or no, but was that a regular season game?
He also had that game against Iowa at home where he played really well.
Yes, that's true as well. So it is one of those things. They went out and Tucker was a late addition in terms of an incoming freshman recruit, and Carlisle was sort of one of these signature portal pieces they got. But when Leal plays, they win Big Ten games when he gets minutes. If you look back at last year and starting so far this season, and so there are definitely limits with Leal, but to your point, he knows where to be. And frankly, he's a leader out there. There was one play where kind of shot clock was winding down, and he sort of instructed everybody on the court for Ballo and Galloway to run a side ball screen, and the other three guys came over where Leal was. Leal was in the short corner. Galloway took the pick, and he made the pass to Leal, and that was that like flagrant foul where the guy kind of like fell on his head, right? And that play only developed, and he only got to the line and frankly saved that possession because he was directing traffic around there. So I think, yes, you know what you're going to get from him. Obviously, he's going to give up some things offensively. I feel like this year he's also, there were games last year where he took shots. I feel like he really kind of shies away from shooting, but I also wonder this year on this team if that's not the worst thing, because there are a lot of other talented scorers on this team, and you could use a glue guy and not at the fifth guy in the court that's directing traffic, that's playing defense, that's in the right spots, that's being a leader out there. And conversely, I mean, when you look at Carlisle's numbers, I mean, it's, it ain't pretty. I mean, his offensive rating is 79.8, which everybody else is up over 100 except for Tucker, who's at 92.5. I mean, Hatton's even at 100.3. So I think, look at Carlisle's rest of his profile. I mean, he's 10 for 44 on threes, but he shot the second most on the team. Mbako shot 66. No, excuse me. Luke Goody shot 66 as well. So Mbako and Goody obviously leaders 66. Rice is at 41, and then he's at 44, right? And Galloway's at 39. So that kind of goes back to who's taking the threes, right? And at this point, I think Carlisle, should not be taking as many as some of these other guys. He's 11 for 29 on twos, 37%. Barely has gotten to the line. He's only gotten to the line 5 times the entire year. So we talk, I think a lot of people, and you said it too, his confidence is shot, or to me, he still he doesn't look, his body language is still good. He still looks like he's getting after it. It's just nothing is going in. So I think, again, Leal versus him right now, if he's not making any shots and Leal is kind of getting you a little bit more of the dirty work, I get why Leal is getting the minutes over him. But if Carlisle is able to figure something out or to start eventually going on a little bit of an offensive spurt, I think he'll certainly be given license to continue to get minutes. But yeah. And then I guess that with Tucker, we were talking about this before we recorded too. He is such like a mid-range maven that I think often he kind of comes in and it's like he's playing his own game. Like, I'm just going to get to my spots and get my shots up and do that very quickly. And I'm sure he's very used to doing that over his career. But it is kind of a fit sometimes that there have been games where against, lesser competition where he's gone out and just scored and scored and scored. And he's a scorer, but he's got to bring more to the table than just getting shots up. And I do think that against Penn State, when he got back cut and dunked behind him in the first half. He came down. Actually, it's kind of a weird play that he kind of went around. He kind of did a loop around. Ballo got the ball and scored himself. He got a couple defensive rebounds as well during that stretch. And then he was one of the guys that brought the ball to the court at one point in the second half, broke the press, found a Goody for a 3-pointer. So if he can at least bring some other stuff, and I think he's talented enough to do that, that's kind of maybe what the bench's role here is. Maybe they're not going to be, elite scorers or, be doing that as much right now. But if you're going to be on the court, you can't be minus on both ends, and you can't not also be doing the details and the dirty work. And I think as long as they can do that, there can be some sustaining of things. But I think to your point, yeah, offensively right now, I think the bench, it's certainly out of kind of the guard and perimeter positions, have not been up to snuff of late.
Yeah, I think it really stands out when Miles Rice goes to the bench for a prolonged period of time, like he did in the first half of the Penn State game, and then again in the second half. There was I think a 3 or 4 minute stretch where he was to the bench, and at times it feels like it's a little bit heavy in terms of the bench guys that are on the court. I'm not sure what you can do to change that. Maybe you stagger guys a little bit differently until maybe you sub one guy out a little bit earlier in the game, and then you can get him back in. But I just think long term, with the amount of drop off that they're having, until some of these guys start playing better, it's just a risky thing to, you play well out of the gate, and all of a sudden at the 12 or 13 minute mark, you bring in 3 or 4 guys off the bench, and all of a sudden the scoring goes away. And particularly right now with Ballo and Hatton as the backup, it's a really big drop off. It's obviously different when you've got Renew available, but when you're going to Hatton, and then all of a sudden you've got a lineup where you've got Bryson Tucker out there and Kanan Carlisle, just the offense really takes a step back. So obviously not a criticism of those guys in particular, but it's just basically the facts of how they're playing right now. And I think it's something that Indiana has to be really careful with, particularly when when the competition level picks up, because there's a lot of Big Ten teams coming up on the schedule. Illinois, for example, there's not a much drop off when Illinois goes to its bench or when they play different guys. You're not going to be able to survive a 3 or 4 minute stretch where you don't score a field goal and you don't have anybody out there that can do anything offensively. So that to me, they survived it in the Penn State game. They obviously played well. They deserved to win, but I just think long term they're going to have to do a little bit better in terms of getting production from the bench. Ryan, last thing before we wrap up this episode, it's a weird spot to be in, I think, right now overall with Indiana basketball, with a 12-3 record, 3-1 in the Big Ten. But I think a lot of people are still kind of unsure of the direction of just this particular team and where things are headed. You look at a lot of these early NCAA tournament projections. Obviously, a lot of basketball still to play. Indiana's not in any of these early brackets. They've just now picked up their quad 1 win. I asked the coach, Brian Tonsoni, on last week's episode of Podcast on the Brink, kind of for what Indiana needed to do the rest of the way to get in the tournament. He said 12 or 13 Big Ten wins, which the closer I looked at it, I'm like, well, that's probably not too far off based on what they did in the non-conference. How realistic is it for Indiana to continue playing this well, that the way they've played these last couple of games, and maybe be able to weather the storm over this stretch that's coming up? Because after USC, they've got these 11 games in a row, I believe, in Ken Palm, where they're not favored in a single one. Obviously, I don't think anybody thinks they're going to go 0-11, but can't really afford to go 2-9 or 3-8 in that stretch and expect to make the tournament. So just where are you overall with this team? Are you kind of still with a lot of people in that wait and see mode? Do you think a corner's been turned, or at what point maybe do you feel like you'll have a better feel for where things are?
Well, I'd say this. I did look at this before we jumped on. So the 16 games remaining right now, 12 of them are quad 1 opportunities. And it's almost 13 because Ohio State's at 31 in the net, and it's 1 through 30 of a home game if you beat a team at home that's in the top 30. And they got Ohio State towards the end of the year. So there are a lot of opportunities for Indiana to pick up some quad one wins the rest of the season. I mean, other than this USC game and Washington, I mean, pretty much everyone left on their schedule are good teams that are either rated right around them or rated higher than them. So, look, I think, if I think about the history of Mike Woodson's tenure here, there have certainly been times during Big Ten seasons where they've swooned and the sky is falling. And there have been in every other season times when they've kind of pulled it together and gone on a streak. So I certainly anticipate that the way that they played against Rutgers and Penn State, they will be able to replicate that again in other games, and they are going to get some more quad one victories. I do believe that. Are they going to get enough? Are they going to be able to play at that level that they played these last two games for, the majority of those games? I think that's really what's going to decide it. And so, I don't know if I can sit here and say that I think they're going to be in the tournament, because the evidence still is a little bit light in terms of that. And we sort of have some incomplete information, but I do think as January rolls along here, we will start to get a little bit of a better picture, see where Renew comes along. But again, just seeing how these opportunities that they do have, it's there for them to get in a way that is it's just all right there for them. And whether they seize the moment or not remains for us to observe as the season goes along.
Yeah, well, we'll obviously have it all covered on Inside the Hall and on Podcast on the Brink. Ryan, thanks for taking the time to join us on this week's episode. Always fun to talk to you.
No doubt.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating over on Spotify. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.